Welcome to this lecture on architecture and archaeology. This is the third lecture in this series. It comes in two parts, and this is the first part, which was subtitled The Death of the Modernist Dream. Now, we go on the lecture on modernism. I started to talk about problems that dog the post-war reconstruction in Britain, and we have a whole series of things which we're going to talk about in this lecture. Firstly, think about the physical problems of new buildings, then the homelessness crisis, the effects of neoliberalism and its rise from the late 1970s, early 1980s onwards, the problems of maintenance and vandalism, and then the post-97 Blairite response to this. So starting with the physical problems with new buildings, when we think about modernist architecture, you think about the phrase of utopia. Utopia, of course, meaning no place. And so Peter Blake writes this book, a kind of a memoir as much as anything else, called No Place Like Utopia, Modern Architecture and the Company We Kept. And it reflects the problems that came about with the modernist architectural ideology, where the utopia that the modernists dreamed of tended to turn into a nightmare for many people. So in this lecture, we're going to actually turn away from the modern architect and think a little bit more about the actual delivery of things on the ground. And I've talked previously about the Roman point collapse, and it shows you what happens when a building system is pushed beyond its intended tolerances. The incident was only, however, the most dramatic manifestation of physical problems that plagued a great many of the post-war estates. Experimental building techniques, low building specifications, shoddy workmanship, these combined to create real environmental problems. And policy documents from the late 1960s show a great number of things which demonstrated the problems of these new buildings, which were reliant on experimental building techniques, which didn't always work terribly well. There was a lot of shoddy workmanship, issues around poor insulation, water penetration, condensation, and mould. And you have to remember that while a lot of the slum housing that was demolished was appalling, and getting rid of it was an undoubted social good, not all the housing that ended up being demolished was unsalvageable. Indeed, was often knocked down for strategic reasons to create large development parcels. And indeed, in demolishing slum areas, communities were often consciously broken up. Not always, but it was generally an effect of those demolitions, because not everybody in that community would be a priority for rehousing on the council's housing list. And the problem was that council property wasn't always a better option for a lot of people. In England in particular, which has its culture of single-family housing, the slum houses, these tiny little back-to-back cottages, were seen as single-family units. And this was popular in terms of its form, if not the actual structures that were built. Now you compare that to what a lot of the housing ended up being built as, which was tower blocks and flats, which a lot of English people in particular were not keen on. The other question was, of course, that council rents were often a lot more expensive than the rents of appalling slum houses. So people who were on extremely marginal incomes suddenly found themselves on even more marginal incomes. And then there's issues around about noise pollution, because the way that flat blocks were built, even in the most expensive flat blocks, noise transmission between apartments is a real problem. And this wasn't so much of an issue when these flats were originally conceived of as being for older people, people without children, and indeed in an age before we had large-scale use of TVs and radios owned by tenants of council housing. But of course, that changes quite quickly, and your home becomes quite nightmarish if you're in a flat with lots and lots of music going on. I love this illustration because it has these little musical diagrams as if the insulation between flats would stop any transmission down to the flats below. But of course, those flats were very noisy, very poorly insulated, because they weren't particularly well built. And again, I mentioned children there. Children were never supposed to be in high-rise flats, but it was families with children who were most in need of rehousing, so that when you start building tower blocks, then it's inevitable that families with kids are going to end up in them. And there were a couple of really key studies in this period. Joan Maisel's 1961 report, 2 to 5 in high flats, and then 10 years on, Carl Jeffcott's 1971 Homes in High Flats. Both demonstrated that children raised in tower blocks socialised less than their peers, and there were a variety of other problems associated with them. But the period 1961 to 71 between Joan Masel's report and that of Karl Jafka, there was a period of intense building of apartment blocks and tower blocks. So the government responded to this in part by removing the additional subsidies for high-rise building, which had actually generated a lot of the high-rise construction in England. They were removed in 1967, although in Scotland these weren't removed till the early 1980s. So the Scots continued building high-rise really until the early 80s. In England, however, the 1970s council housing was overwhelmingly two-storey single-family units. Now, on one level, that's a response to the kinds of preferences of the English housing dwellers for these things like single-family homes. Flat living is not popular in the UK. But the other reason why we start building a lot more two-storey houses is because it's darn sight cheaper. And particularly with that subsidy removed in 1967, clearly councils are going to move to a different kind of housing type, and indeed a more popular kind of housing type. So that's the end of our first section. We're moving on now to talk about the homelessness crisis. Cathy Come Home was a dramatic and important play that was filmed and put onto TV in the late 60s. And what it did was completely galvanise a debate which had really not reached the public's imagination until this film was produced. Essentially what happened was that in the story, a young mother is passed through a series of poor housing options by local authority, indeed ends up being deliberately separated from her husband, and then at the end of it, her child is repossessed and taken into care because it's determined that she is incapable of finding her own accommodation. The Birmingham Evening Mail and Alderman Frank Griffin from Birmingham City Council are cited on the back of the book version of the play here, because although it was never said, this was largely based on practice in Birmingham, where again families were deliberately broken up if they were unable to find appropriate housing. The broadcast of Cathy Come Home directly led to the formation of Shelter in the late 1960s, and after about a decade of lobbying, the Housing and Homeless Persons Act of 1977 was passed. And this changed the law on housing. It gave a statutory duty to rehouse homeless families. Now, many councils were already doing this. Many councils were already prioritising families with children in terms of their housing. But what tended to happen was the Act reinforced tendencies towards residualisation. There were already sort of unofficial policies, and sometimes actually official policies, of segregation. You would not put your most vulnerable, your poorest, your problematic tenants into your good neighbourhoods, into your housing stock, which was popular with the people living there. You would unofficially put people into the worst housing stock. We have this report by the Architectural Research Unit in 1974 looking at Deptford, which was called Difficult to Let, and it identified properties which even people with any kind of choice would simply say, I'm not going to live on that particular estate. So it was only the poorest and most vulnerable people who would live there, and they'd be living in estates with the worst housing stock. So what you end up with is this kind of self-fulfilling prophecy of the creation of sink estates. The worst housing, the most vulnerable people, most socially problematic people, concentrated into these very large estates. So that's a bad situation, and then along comes neoliberalism. The 1980s saw a breaking of the post-war settlement with the rise of neoliberalism. The post-war settlement was essentially that whether Labour or Conservative governments in power, there was a general sense of responsibility that the state should try to provide for the most vulnerable. That had always been an aim of policy. With the rise of a neoliberal policy, a Conservative government comes to power where the emphasis is on holding down public spending to pay for lower taxation among the middle classes, rather than to help society's poorest and most vulnerable. So although residualisation and sink estates were already forming in the 1970s, the 1980s spending cuts and ideological shift led to a much greater concentration of these tendencies. And as neoliberalism starts to happen, you see the rise of a highly politicised counterculture reacting against the abandonment of the inner city, the statement that basically if you're poor, it's your own fault, we're not going to help you out of the state, and you get the rise of things like highly politicised rap music. Classic example of this is NWA's Straight Outta Compton, the origins of gangster rap, where you actually have a group of people who are saying, okay, you've abandoned us, we are now in a state of lawlessness, we will run society as we want. NWA, this particular album, is sort of half political and then half a kind of party album. But later acts along, such as Suprême NTM in France. NTM stands for Nique ta mère, which those of you who speak French will know is quite rude. Paris sur les bombes in 1995 is kind of an expression of this same political rage, probably far more politicised in many ways than NWA. But the difference between NTM and NWA is that where American rap music was very much a rap of the inner city, French rap music is very much a rap of les banlieues, the suburbs, because in Paris and other French cities they tended to build their large housing estates not in the inner city, on slum-cleared land, but out in the far suburbs. So you actually have quite a different geographical manifestation of politicised rap music reacting against the neoliberal abandonment of the inner city across these two countries. But if we return to the UK, we have to look at Margaret Thatcher, who was elected to power in 1979 and reigned until 1990, and was really the architect of the neoliberal agenda in Britain and introduced it in a really positive form, positive in a strong sort of way. She introduced the right to buy, which meant that people had the right to buy their council housing. Now, in many ways, this was a great social good. It gave people the opportunity to buy, at a substantial discount in many ways, housing that people built in the 1920s through 1940s, often three-bedroom houses in decent areas. It tended to be those kinds of houses, not the tower blocks on the difficult-to-let estates, that were sold. And in doing so, Margaret Thatcher shored up support for the Conservative Party from the so-called respectable working class, sometimes designated as the C1s and C2s, who were a core element in her electoral support. But the problem with the right to buy wasn't the fact that this housing stock was sold, but that local authorities were then not allowed to spend the money that was raised building replacement housing. So what happened was that you got a huge reduction in the amount of good housing stock, the kind of big three-bedroomed, well-built houses from the 1920s to 1940s that people wanted to rent. And so you end up with councils really concentrating their ownership of housing in the bad areas of bad housing. And by the time John Major becomes Prime Minister in 1990, council housing generally has virtually stopped. So you end up with a situation where local authorities are catering to the very poorest and most vulnerable with the worst, environmentally worst, physically worst housing stock. And then it gets even worse because we have issues of maintenance and vandalism. It's fun recording this. I have a very heavy cold trying to do it. Maintenance and vandalism is a really bad combination. You've got, by the 1980s, estates that are already starting to age rather badly, built in the 1950s and 60s, experimental building techniques, starting, frankly, to physically fall apart because they weren't built properly in the first place. So you have physically problematic estates, and then you concentrate the poorest and most vulnerable people in those states. And unsurprisingly, you get alienation, you get vandalism, you get social deprivation, and sweeping through the estates in the 1990s, huge problems, 80s and 90s, huge problems with drugs. In combination with huge, swinging cuts to maintenance budgets for local authorities. So central government basically stops local authorities from spending money maintaining their housing stock. And part of the reason for that is that maintenance budgets aren't very sexy. This is a kind of sexy image, as a local politician, you want to be opening the 10,000th council dwelling. You don't want to be standing outside the house of, Mrs. Smith of 98 Stoneton Grove and saying, look, we've fixed her leaky roof, because you kind of expect that should just happen anyway. It's not a photo opportunity. Now, In the UK, we never quite reached the disastrous levels of abandonment that you see in America. Places like Igo, which is famously demolished, but also the Robert Taylor homes here on the south side of Chicago. What you see here is these tower blocks stretching all the way into the distance. They were being knocked down when I took this photograph back in 2001. And you see this massive interstate here. On the one side, you have designated housing for black people, and it really was seen as very much housing for black people. Then you have this huge interstate to create a barrier, and on the other side was a traditionally Irish area that voted for Mayor Daley, who was the guy who was king of Chicago at this time. Very much an issue of segregation and separation. Scary stuff, and these things were largely abandoned after they were built. Huge, huge environmental problems. Just the things were falling apart from day one. Similarly, we have problems in the UK. This is Chillingham Tower. It was knocked down a few years ago, but for quite a long time it was in a very, very bad state, and people were living in it right up until the end. This area at the bottom here is fenced off because there was a rat's nest in there, really quite severe rat problem. But the council weren't able to do anything about it because every time they tried to get into that space, people would drop stuff on them from high above. So they had to fence the area off to try to prevent people from trying to kill their maintenance workers, and so the rat problem remained undealt with. And another layer of problems, you have the 1980s riots. You have riots in Toxteth, Broadwater Farm, Handsworth. This is early 80s. It's sort of fed off the sense of alienation and abandonment, both economic, social, and also environmental. And the fact that you started getting TV coverage of police having to go into these neighbourhoods and batter, frankly, the people who lived there. Even the Thatcher government wasn't so keen on seeing that nightly on TV. So there was a sense of something had to be done for the inner city. And lots of things did occur, one of which was a scheme called Estate Action. And this sort of set a precedent for a whole variety of different funding schemes: City Challenge, Estate Renewal Challenge Fund, Single Generation Budget, New Deal for Communities, where basically, as a local authority, you were able to bid for central government funding to say, this area in which we live is truly terrible, we need to invest a huge amount of money on this particular estate, give us the money. Ours is the most desperately in need compared to, say, a housing estate in Wolverhampton. It was a sort of sense of a slam dunk approach. We'll just throw a lot of money at the problem and it will fix everything that's wrong on this estate. That didn't really work when we did it in the 1950s and 60s, and it didn't really work in the 1980s, 90s either. The other thing was that really until the mid-90s there was a lot of emphasis on solving environmental problems, repairing the built fabric of these estates that were falling apart. They were doing little to tackle underlying socio-economic problems. So again, we have a bit of a return to the environmental determinism trap. If we make the housing better, then the estate will somehow work again. Whereas what you actually have is a lot of very, very vulnerable, socially deprived people living in terrible conditions. If you simply give them double glazing, they'll be slightly warmer, but still living in terrible conditions in poverty. So you have things like Wiley Birch. I took this photo about 10 years after the 1990s refurbishment of these estates, and even 10 years ago they were looking pretty ruined. And you also see the sort of institutional jollity of they've repainted the blocks and put fancy patterns on the front of them. No one is going to mistake this for anything other than a place where poor people live. Again, neighbouring buildings which were awaiting repair, you actually see that some of them had double glazing installed, but you also see steel grills on some of the windows to stop people breaking in and ripping the copper pipes out of the walls and causing flooding. This is not a happy neighbourhood at this time, and again, this estate had had a great deal of money spent on it, but did little to actually tackle the underlying socio-economic problems. So along comes 1997, and we get the Blairite response to this. We have a new government elected in 1997, a new Labour government, which accepts many of the policy changes of the Thatcherite neoliberal era, but does try to do something a little bit more socially just alongside it. In 1999, we have the Urban Task Force report towards an urban renaissance, chaired by Lord Rogers of Riverside, world famous architect. And in that report, they talk about design excellence, social well-being, and environmental responsibility. So design excellence comes first, not particularly surprising if you get Richard Rogers on board, but even still, you have this real sense of buildings coming first in the design of new communities. Again, a bit of a return to environmental determinism thing. You also have a new ideology comes into play, where you have high-rise housing, and this is seen as bad. This is what we did in the 60s. Here we have this low-rise, high-density housing, which is what we did in the 70s, and this is also seen as bad. So what Rogers et al. Recommend is this sort of mid-rise stuff. 4, 5 stories, relatively high-density housing, but quite a bit of open space, and also mixed using within it. So not just residential, but a mix of workspaces, leisure, retail, and so on. And that becomes a new kind of ideology in the post-97 period. The Department of Communities and Local Government had as its mission statement at this time a safe, healthy and sustainable environment for all, and starts to have this notion of sustainability absolutely at the core of its business, talking about it from a three-legged stool, a tripartite holistic conception of sustainability, mixing together environmental, economic and social factors. But in the post sort of 1960s era, we have to remember that the actual delivery of new kinds of cities is done by the politicians and the policymakers, not by the architects. So there's suite of lectures about architecture and ideology, but very largely the delivery of this stuff is about politicians and policymakers, and this is where you have to think about ideology playing out in these sort of settings. Now, in the next bit of this lecture, which will be in a separate YouTube presentation, we're going to look at the response of the architects and the planners to adapt to the modernist dream. So we're going to come away from the politicians and see what the architects and planners started to do. But to sum up this first session, many of the estates built in the 1950s and 1960s had major structural and environmental flaws. Housing policy tended to exacerbate problems of residualisation, creating sink estates. Neoliberal urban policies exacerbated pre-existing problems, and simply solving the environmental problems will not tackle underlying social malaise. So contemporary regeneration policy claims a more holistic approach to tackling socio-economic problems as well as the environment, although in practice this can be rather problematic.